The day Emily Carter sold her wedding ring, the man behind the pawnshop counter offered her $2,000 less than Daniel had once claimed it was worth, and somehow, that felt honest. The ring lay between them on a scratched glass counter in a narrow shop on the south side of Boston, catching the pale January light as if it still believed it belonged in a better story. Outside, traffic hissed over dirty slush along the curb. A bus groaned past. Somewhere behind her, an old radio played a weather report about another 6 inches of snow coming before midnight. Emily kept her hands folded in front of her so the man would not see them shake. "You're sure you want to sell it?" he asked, not unkindly, because even in places built for desperation, some people still remembered how to speak softly. Emily looked down at the diamond, at the thin platinum band Daniel Whitmore had slid onto her finger 8 years earlier in front of 200 guests, a string quartet, and a wall of white roses that had cost more than her first car. Back then, everyone had called it a fairy tale. Her mother had cried. Daniel's father had raised a glass and toasted to legacy. Daniel had whispered that he would spend the rest of his life protecting her. Human beings, as a species, had always been strangely confident while making promises they had no intention of keeping. "I'm sure," Emily said. Her voice came out calm, almost detached, as if it belonged to a woman standing several feet away from her own body. The man nodded, turned the ring under a small lamp, and began typing numbers into his computer. Emily watched his fingers move and tried not to remember Daniel's hands, the way they used to rest at the small of her back at charity dinners, guiding her through rooms full of people who admired him and barely saw her. She had spent years smiling beside him while he built Whitmore Advisory Group from a sleek rented office into a name that appeared in business magazines and investor panels. She had proofread his speeches at 2 a.m., organized dinners with clients, remembered birthdays of people he forgot, softened the sharp edges of his ambition so others could stand close enough to invest in it. But when the company finally began to shine, Daniel told the world he had built it alone. And when Vanessa Blake appeared, younger, polished, and fluent in the language of admiration, he told Emily she had become too small for the life he was meant to lead. The divorce had been fast, polite, and cruel in the way expensive lawyers made cruelty look civilized. Emily left their Back Bay townhouse with 2 suitcases, a used Subaru, and a settlement that sounded generous until rent, medical bills, and unpaid credit cards began eating through it like winter salt through metal. Now the last beautiful object from her marriage sat on a pawnshop counter, stripped of romance, reduced to clarity, cut, and resale value. "I can do 4,300, the man said. Emily stared at the number printed on the slip. Once, Daniel had told her the ring meant forever. Today, forever was worth 1 month of rent, a box of glass jars, raw shea butter, beeswax, essential oils, shipping labels, and maybe enough left over for groceries if she bought carefully. She almost laughed. Instead, she signed her name. The man counted the cash into an envelope and slid it toward her. Emily picked it up with both hands, and for one awful second, grief rose in her throat so sharply she thought she might have to sit down. Not because she still wanted Daniel. That part had been burned clean. She grieved the woman who had believed love meant disappearing quietly into someone else's dream. She grieved the years she had mistaken loyalty for self-erasure. She grieved the foolish, tender hope that if she gave enough, worked enough, forgave enough, she would finally be chosen in a room where she had already been replaced. Then she placed the empty velvet ring box into her coat pocket, turned toward the door, and stepped back into the cold with the envelope pressed against her ribs. By nightfall, that money would be spread across her kitchen table in the form of ingredients, receipts, and one second-hand mixer she found 40 minutes away in Quincy. By morning, her tiny apartment would smell like lavender, honey, and melted wax. And years later, when Daniel Whitmore stood frozen beneath the lights of a crowded investment gala, staring at the name Carter and Bloom on a 30-foot screen with the words valued at $18 million beneath it, he would have no idea that the empire embarrassing him in front of everyone had begun with the ring he once used to claim her. That night, Emily carried the groceries and supplies up 3 flights of narrow stairs to her apartment in Dorchester, stopping twice because the second-hand mixer was heavier than it had looked in the listing photo and because grief, annoyingly, did not make a person stronger in the arms. Her apartment was small enough that every room had to serve two purposes. The kitchen was also her office. The living room was also her bedroom when she fell asleep on the couch with bills spread across the coffee table. The hallway closet held winter coats, cleaning supplies, and the remnants of a life she had not yet found the courage to throw away. But as she set the brown paper bags on the kitchen table, something shifted. The envelope from the pawn shop was gone, replaced by jars, labels, raw ingredients, packing tape, and a spiral notebook with a blue cover. It was not much. It certainly did not look like the beginning of anything worth mentioning at a business gala. It looked like a woman trying not to drown. Still, Emily took off her coat, rolled up the sleeves of her old gray sweater, and began. She measured beeswax into a dented metal bowl, added shea butter by the ounce, and watched it soften over a pan of simmering water. The scent rose slowly, warm and clean, filling the apartment with something that did not belong to Daniel, Vanessa, or the polished rooms of her former life. Lavender came next, then a touch of honey, then a few drops of vitamin E oil she had bought because an online forum said it helped preserve handmade products longer. She had spent the afternoon at the public library reading about small batch skincare, product safety, labeling rules, and basic bookkeeping, her notebook filling with careful lines of handwriting that looked steadier than she felt. She did not know enough. That was the frightening part. But she knew how to learn. She had taught herself Daniel's client software when his assistant quit without notice. She had learned the names of investors' spouses, children, favorite wines, and college teams so Daniel could walk into rooms appearing thoughtful. She had rewritten his investor decks until his ideas sounded clearer than they were. Competence had never been her problem. Recognition had. At 11:17 p.m., the first batch cooled in 6 small glass jars near the window, pale cream beneath silver lids. Emily printed labels from an aging inkjet printer that jammed twice and made a sound like it personally resented being alive. She had chosen the name hours earlier while standing in the kitchen aisle of a discount store, holding empty jars and trying not to cry under fluorescent lights. Carter was hers, the name she had been born with and had quietly taken back after the divorce. Bloom was what she wanted to believe could still happen, even after a life had been cut down to the stem. Carter and Bloom. She whispered it once, then wrote it on the first label. The words looked too elegant for the cracked kitchen tile and the radiator that clanged every 15 minutes. But maybe that was the point. By midnight, her best friend Grace Miller arrived with takeout soup, 2 coffees, and the expression of a woman prepared to insult anyone necessary in the name of loyalty. Grace had been a nurse for 12 years, which meant she had seen enough human foolishness to no longer be impressed by men in expensive suits. She took one look at the jars and said, "Emily, these are beautiful." Emily wanted to believe her. Instead, she laughed softly and said, "They are 6 jars of lotion made by a divorced woman who sold her ring for rent money." Grace picked one up, turned it beneath the light, and read the label as if it were already sitting on a shelf somewhere important. "No," she said. "They are 6 jars made by a woman who finally stopped funding a man's dream and started funding her own." The words landed too gently to argue with. Emily looked around the kitchen at the receipts, the cooling wax, the dirty bowls, the notebook filled with numbers, and the empty space on her left hand where a diamond had once announced her belonging to someone else. The skin there looked pale and vulnerable, but not ruined. She touched it with her thumb and felt, for the first time that day, not free exactly, but reachable. As if freedom were not a door swinging open all at once, but a small light left on somewhere down the hall. Before Grace left, she bought the first 2 jars for $20 each and refused change. Emily protested, because pride remained one of the few luxuries she could afford. Grace ignored her, because good friends are often rude in useful ways. After the door closed, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table and opened a new page in the notebook. At the top, she wrote first sales, $40. Beneath it, after a long pause, she wrote proof I can begin. By the end of the first week, Emily had sold 12 jars, which was not enough to change her life, but was enough to make her stand a little differently in the grocery store checkout line. Small numbers had a strange dignity when they belonged entirely to her. 12 jars meant 12 people had chosen something she made with her own hands. 12 jars meant she could buy another pound of shea butter, more labels, and 1 roll of bubble wrap, without checking her bank account with the terror of someone waiting for bad news from a doctor. She began waking before sunrise, when Dorchester was still blue and quiet beneath the winter sky, to melt wax and answer messages before leaving for her part-time job at a neighborhood stationery shop. The job paid $16 an hour and came with paper cuts, tired feet, and customers who sometimes treated greeting cards as if they were legal documents requiring divine consultation. But it kept the lights on, and after years of being Daniel Whitmore's unpaid support system, Emily found a modest comfort in wages that arrived because her name was on the schedule. Every evening, she came home, changed into sweatpants, tied her hair back, and returned to the kitchen where Carter and Bloom waited like a fragile secret. The apartment grew crowded with supplies. Glass jars lined the windowsill. Shipping boxes leaned against the refrigerator. A handwritten chart above the sink tracked expenses, orders, and mistakes. There were many mistakes. One batch separated overnight into oily layers. Another smelled too strongly of rosemary and made Grace cough politely before saying, with the careful kindness of a nurse delivering difficult news, "This one has confidence." Emily laughed until her eyes watered, then crossed out the formula and started again. In those hours, with steam fogging the window and the old radiator clanking like an irritated ghost, she found herself remembering the early years with Daniel, before betrayal had become a fact instead of a suspicion. Back then, he had not seemed cruel. That was the most humiliating part. Cruelty rarely introduces itself honestly. It arrives wearing ambition, charm, and a tailored navy suit. Daniel had been brilliant in public, attentive when others were watching, and endlessly certain that the world was only a few strategic moves away from recognizing his greatness. Emily had believed in him before investors did. She had believed in him before his own father did. When his first office was a 300-square-foot room above a dental clinic in Cambridge, she spent weekends assembling cheap furniture, bringing coffee, and pretending not to notice when he snapped at her because fear made him mean. He always apologized later. He always brought flowers. He always said pressure made him difficult, but success would make everything easier. Success did not make anything easier. It simply gave his flaws better lighting. As Whitmore Advisory grew, Daniel began speaking to Emily as if she were furniture in a room he had outgrown. He corrected her in front of clients. He called her practical ideas cute. He told her not to worry about business conversations, then used her notes in meetings the next morning. When she asked about returning to the product design courses she had left unfinished years earlier, he kissed her forehead and said, "Maybe once things settle down." Things never settled down. They expanded around his needs and shrank around hers. Then Vanessa Blake arrived as a brand consultant with glossy hair, clean white blazers, and a gift for making Daniel feel like a visionary instead of a man who needed constant rescuing from his own impatience. Emily first noticed the perfume on his jacket, something bright and expensive that did not belong to their house. Then came the late meetings, the guarded phone screen, the sudden irritation whenever Emily asked simple questions. When she found a restaurant receipt from a place in Seaport where Daniel had once promised to take her for their anniversary, he looked at her with weary disappointment, as if her pain were an administrative inconvenience. "You are reading into things because you are unhappy with yourself," he said. The sentence was so calm, so polished, that for a moment she almost believed she was the problem. That was Daniel's true talent. Not finance, not leadership. Rewriting reality until the person he hurt began apologizing for bleeding on the carpet. Months later, when he finally admitted he was leaving, he called it a necessary evolution. Vanessa, he said, understood the scale of his future. Emily stood in their kitchen beneath the pendant lights she had chosen, beside the marble island she had saved for, and listened as her marriage was reduced to a branding decision. "You are a good person," Daniel told her, which was what people said when they wanted permission to be selfish without feeling vulgar. "But I need someone who can stand beside where I am going." Now, in her small apartment, Emily tightened the lid on a jar of lavender cream and placed it into a box for a customer in Worcester. For years, she had stood beside where Daniel was going. She had simply forgotten to ask where she herself might have gone if she had not been busy holding his map. The weeks after Daniel left had trained Emily in a particular kind of arithmetic, the cruel little math of starting over when every number seemed designed to humiliate you. Rent was due on the 1st. Car insurance came out on the 7th. The credit card Daniel had promised to pay down still carried charges from client dinners where she had smiled across white tablecloths while men discussed markets as if they had personally invented money. Her health insurance premium arrived like a threat disguised as an envelope. Even the small things had teeth. Laundry, quarters, parking meters, a bottle of store-brand detergent. The world, Emily discovered, charged admission for survival. She kept a yellow legal pad beside the kitchen sink and wrote every expense in neat columns because panic became slightly less monstrous when forced into handwriting. One evening, after her shift at the stationery shop, she sat at the table with a calculator, a mug of peppermint tea gone cold, and 3 unpaid bills arranged in front of her like judges. Carter and Bloom had sold 27 jars by then, mostly to Grace's co-workers at the hospital, 2 women from Emily's old yoga class, and a retired teacher in Brookline who had left a 5-star review that simply said, "This made my hands feel human again." Emily had read that sentence 6 times. It was not just praise. It was proof that something she made could reach another person in a private, useful way. Still, usefulness did not erase debt. Her checking account balance was $312. The rent was $1,800. She had 11 days. Grace told her she could stay in her spare room if things got too tight, but Emily could not bear the thought of packing her life again. She had already been moved once by Daniel's decisions. She refused to become a woman carried from place to place by other people's damage. So she took more hours at the shop, accepted custom stationery work on weekends, and began making products after midnight, when the city outside her window went quiet and the only light in the apartment came from the stove and the small lamp over her notebook. Exhaustion softened the edges of memory, but it did not erase them. Some nights, as she stirred melted wax in slow circles, she could still hear Daniel's voice from the final meeting with their attorneys. He had sat across the conference table in a charcoal suit, perfectly shaved, perfectly composed, while Emily's whole body felt as if it had been assembled incorrectly. Vanessa had not been there, but her presence lived in the careful new confidence Daniel wore, the confidence of a man already applauded by someone else. His attorney spoke about marital assets, separate accounts, business ownership, reasonable settlement terms. The words sounded clean. The reality beneath them was filthy with imbalance. Emily had helped build Daniel's professional life in ways no spreadsheet captured, but the law, like most human systems, had a talent for recognizing paper before sacrifice. Daniel's name was on the company documents. Daniel's name was on the accounts. Daniel's name was on the office lease. Her labor had been everywhere and legally nowhere. When she asked for time to review the final agreement, Daniel sighed with theatrical patience and said, "Emily, dragging this out will only make it harder for you to move on." Even then, he had made her pain sound like a delay in his schedule. She signed 2 days later because fighting him would have cost money she did not have and strength she was still trying to locate. The settlement covered a few months, not a future. The townhouse stayed with Daniel. The friends stayed mostly silent. Invitations stopped arriving without explanation. People who had once praised her dinner parties now crossed rooms to avoid choosing sides, which meant, in the cowardly language of polite society, that they had chosen his. One afternoon, Daniel's mother mailed Emily a small box containing a few framed photographs and a note written on thick cream stationery. "I hope you find peace," it said, as if peace were a misplaced earring Emily might discover under the couch. Emily placed the photos face down in a drawer and did not answer. Now, in the apartment she could barely afford, she looked at the stack of bills, then at the 20 jars cooling beside the stove. Each one had a label she had cut by hand because the printer alignment was still slightly wrong. Each one smelled faintly of lavender and honey. Each one represented a choice Daniel would never understand. He had measured worth in scale, status, and applause. Emily was beginning with one customer at a time. It was slower, less glamorous, and painfully uncertain. It was also hers. At 1:36 a.m., she packed 6 orders into padded mailers, wrote thank you notes in blue ink, and added one sentence at the bottom of each card. "You are allowed to begin again." She did not realize until the last envelope was sealed that she had written it for herself. By the second month, Emily's kitchen no longer looked like a kitchen so much as a very small factory that had lost an argument with a thrift store. Measuring cups dried beside dinner plates. Cardboard boxes sat where a fruit bowl used to be. A roll of labels lived next to the toaster. Her refrigerator held almond milk, half a lemon, and a stack of printed order forms clipped together with a magnet shaped like Cape Cod. It was not elegant, but elegance had never paid a bill on time. Carter and Bloom had grown from Grace's co-workers to strangers Emily had never met, which felt both miraculous and terrifying. Orders came through her small website at odd hours, 1 from Maine, 2 from Rhode Island, 3 from Connecticut, then 1 from a woman in Ohio who wrote that her sister had mailed her a jar after a divorce and she wanted to send one to her daughter. Emily read that message standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile, holding her phone in one hand and a spoon covered in melted balm in the other. For a moment, the apartment seemed to go completely still. She had thought she was making skincare because she needed money. Maybe that was how it started. But somewhere between the lavender, the handwritten notes, and the women who kept writing back, it had become something stranger and deeper. She was packaging permission. Permission to feel tired. Permission to feel angry. Permission to start over without making it look graceful for other people's comfort. On a Saturday morning in March, she carried a folding table, 2 plastic bins, and 60 jars into a community market in Jamaica Plain. The air smelled of roasted coffee, wet wool coats, and maple pastries. Vendors arranged sourdough loaves, handmade candles, knitted scarves, and tiny watercolor prints of Boston brownstones. Emily sat up between a retired man selling wooden cutting boards and a college student with earrings shaped like strawberries. She had stayed up until 2:45 a.m. tying cream-colored ribbon around each jar because some ridiculous part of her wanted everything to look worthy before anyone decided whether she was. At first, people walked past. They glanced, smiled politely, and moved on to things they understood more quickly, like bread. Emily's stomach tightened with every passing coat. She began rearranging jars that did not need rearranging. Then an older woman with silver hair and a camel-colored coat stopped in front of the table. She picked up a jar, opened it, and inhaled. "This smells like my grandmother's linen closet," she said. Emily was not sure whether that was good or catastrophic. In a good way, the woman added, saving civilization by providing context. Her name was Margaret Hayes, and she asked questions no casual shopper would ask. Where did Emily source her ingredients? How long was each batch stable? Did she track customer reactions? Did she know her cost per unit? Emily answered honestly, sometimes confidently, sometimes with the humility of a woman who had learned business from library books, late-night videos, and consequences. Margaret listened without condescension. That alone made Emily trust her a little. She bought 4 jars, then paused with her wallet still open. "You have something here," she said. "Not just the product. The feeling." Emily smiled carefully, the way people smile when hope approaches too fast and they are afraid it might be selling something. "I am still figuring it out." Margaret placed a business card on the table. Hayes Retail Group. Former regional director. Boutique consultant. "Good," she said. The people who think they have everything figured out usually ruin perfectly good companies by lunchtime. After she left, Emily stood behind the table pretending to straighten ribbons while reading the card 3 times. By the end of the market, she had sold 42 jars and traded 1 lavender balm for a loaf of cranberry walnut bread because entrepreneurship, apparently, occasionally returned to the barter system like humanity had learned nothing. She drove home through light rain with the empty bins rattling in the back seat of the Subaru and felt a cautious warmth spreading through her chest. Not triumph. Not yet. But direction. That night, she pinned Margaret's card to the wall above her expense chart. It hung there beside the numbers, the rent reminders, and the sentence she had written on a scrap of paper after the divorce. Do not become small just because someone needed you that way. Margaret Hayes did not call the next day or the day after that, because apparently the universe enjoyed giving hope a dramatic pause. Emily tried not to check her phone every 12 minutes and failed with impressive consistency. By Wednesday, she had convinced herself the business card meant nothing, that Margaret had been kind out of habit, the way elegant older women sometimes were when they saw younger women trying very hard not to fall apart in public. On Thursday morning, while Emily was restocking envelopes at the stationery shop, her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron. She glanced down and saw an email subject line that made her forget, for one full second, how lungs worked. Potential wholesale opportunity. She read it in the back room between towers of wedding invitation samples and boxes of printer paper. Margaret wrote with the clean confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime sending emails that made other people stand up straighter. She had shared the lavender bomb with the owner of 3 boutique gift shops in Boston, Cambridge, and Portsmouth. They were interested in a trial order of 150 units, split across 3 cents, with proper labels, batch numbers, ingredient lists, and delivery within 6 weeks. Emily stared at the screen until the words blurred. 150 units. 6 weeks. 3 cents. It might as well have said, "Please build a small moon by Tuesday." Her first instinct was joy, bright and terrifying. Her second was panic, practical and rude. She did not have enough jars. She did not have enough ingredients. She did not have product liability insurance yet. She did not even have a workspace that could produce 150 units without turning her apartment into a fire code complaint with lavender undertones. She forwarded the email to Grace with the message, "I think I am going to be sick." Grace replied 3 minutes later, "Congratulations. Be sick after you invoice them." That evening, Grace came over with her laptop, a legal pad, and the brisk expression she usually wore when hospital administrators said something foolish in meetings. Together, they turned fear into tasks. They priced ingredients by the pound instead of by the tiny bag. They researched insurance. They found a shared commercial kitchen in Somerville that rented production space by the hour to small food and body care businesses. They watched videos about labeling requirements until both of them began to hate the word compliance with the quiet passion of taxpayers everywhere. By midnight, Emily had a spreadsheet with columns for costs, packaging, labor, sales tax, and wholesale margins. The numbers were not romantic. They did not care about betrayal, heartbreak, or symbolism. They simply sat there demanding accuracy. Emily respected them for it. Numbers, unlike Daniel, did not pretend cruelty was concern. The next morning, she emailed Margaret with a price, a timeline, and a professional tone she had rewritten 7 times. Her finger hovered over send so long the screen dimmed. Then she pressed it. Margaret accepted within an hour. The deposit arrived the next day, and Emily stood in her apartment looking at the bank notification as if it were a weather report from a country she had always wanted to visit. For the first time since the divorce, money had entered her life because of her own creation, not as settlement, charity, apology, or damage control. She printed the purchase order and taped it above the kitchen table. The apartment seemed to change around it. The same cracked tile, the same clanking radiator, the same secondhand mixer, but now the room held evidence that effort could become something solid enough for another person to sign. Over the next weeks, Emily lived by alarms. She worked at the shop during the day, rented the Somerville kitchen at night, and drove home after midnight with her hair smelling faintly of honey and rosemary. She learned to pour faster, label straighter, track batches carefully, and stop apologizing for charging what the work was worth. Grace helped when she could. The retired man from the market built her a small wooden display rack in exchange for product for his wife. The college student, with strawberry earrings, designed a simple floral sticker for her boxes at a discount because she said the brand felt like something her mother would love. Slowly, almost shyly, Carter and Bloom began attracting people who wanted it to survive. On the final delivery day, Emily loaded the boxes into her Subaru and drove through morning traffic toward the first boutique on Newberry Street. The storefront window was bright with candles, linen throws, ceramic bowls, and the sort of tasteful objects people bought when they wanted their homes to imply emotional stability. The owner opened the first box, lifted a jar, and smiled. "These look beautiful," she said. Emily felt the words land somewhere deeper than vanity. Beautiful meant ready. Beautiful meant shelf-worthy. Beautiful meant the work had crossed from her kitchen into the world. That afternoon, before leaving the boutique, Emily watched the owner place the first row of Carter and Bloom jars near the front window. For a moment, her reflection appeared faintly in the glass behind them, a tired woman in a thrifted navy coat, with no ring on her finger and no one beside her to validate the sight. She looked at the jars, then at herself, and realized she did not feel empty. She felt unfinished, which was entirely different. 3 weeks after the Newberry Street delivery, Emily saw Daniel for the first time since the divorce papers had been filed, and because life had a talent for arranging humiliation with the precision of a wedding planner, she was carrying 2 cardboard shipping boxes stacked against her chest and wearing jeans dusted with packing tape fuzz. It happened outside a coffee shop near Copley Square, one of those polished places where the pastries sat under glass like museum artifacts and a 12-ounce latte cost enough to make a reasonable person question capitalism. Emily had just dropped off a small wholesale order to a boutique around the corner and was trying to balance her phone, car keys, and a receipt folder when she heard her name. Not the warm version of it. Not the version Grace used when she arrived with soup and emergency sarcasm. This was Daniel's version, smooth and lightly amused, as if he had discovered an old subscription he forgot to cancel. Emily. She turned before she could stop herself. He stood near the entrance in a tailored charcoal overcoat, dark hair perfectly styled despite the wind, one hand resting at the small of Vanessa Blake's back. Vanessa wore a cream wool coat, oversized sunglasses pushed into her glossy hair, and the faint smile of a woman who had been told she had won a prize and had never checked whether it was defective. For a second, the city noise seemed to thin around them. Buses sighed at the curb. A cyclist rang a bell. Someone laughed too loudly behind the coffee shop window. Emily felt the old reflex rise in her body, the instinct to smooth her hair, straighten her shoulders, explain herself before anyone accused her of being less than enough. Then the top box shifted in her arms, and the soft clink of glass jars brought her back to the present. Daniel's eyes dropped to the label on the box. Carter and Bloom. Something passed across his face, too quick to name. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance that she had become connected to words he did not control. So this is the little project, he said, smiling as if generosity had entered the conversation wearing his face. I heard you were making creams now. Vanessa tilted her head. That is sweet, she said. Handmade things are very popular right now. The insult was wrapped so neatly in politeness that Emily almost admired the craftsmanship. Daniel gave a soft laugh. I'm glad you found something to keep busy. After everything, routine is probably good for you. There it was. The old blade in a linen napkin. Not cruel enough for a stranger to object to, not kind enough to be mistaken by anyone who knew the language. Emily looked at him, really looked at him, and was startled by how familiar and small he seemed at the same time. This was the man who had once been the weather in her life, deciding when the room warmed, when it froze, when she was allowed to breathe without bracing for impact. Now he was just a man outside a coffee shop, standing beside the woman he had chosen, trying to make her boxes feel heavier than they were. It is more than a routine, Emily said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her enough that she almost turned to see who had spoken. Daniel's smile tightened. I only mean, do not put too much pressure on yourself. Business can be brutal, especially when it scales. It is not all ribbons and farmers markets. Vanessa touched his sleeve, a small public performance of partnership. Daniel just worries because he knows how hard real business is. Emily felt the sentence land and dissolve. A few months earlier, it might have opened something in her, some old wound eager to prove it still had jurisdiction. But she had spent too many nights calculating margins, labeling jars, correcting mistakes, answering customers, and walking into rooms where no one owed her belief. She knew exactly how hard real business was. She also knew Daniel had mistaken visibility for value his entire life. You are right, she said. It is hard. She shifted the boxes higher against her chest. But some things are worth doing even when they do not come with applause at the beginning. Daniel blinked, and for the first time, he had no elegant answer prepared. Vanessa glanced at the box again, her eyes catching on the logo. Where do you sell them? She asked, trying to sound casual and failing by half an inch. A few local boutiques, Emily said. Online. Small orders for now. She did not mention Newberry Street. She did not mention Margaret Hayes. She did not mention the purchase order taped above her kitchen table or the second wholesale inquiry sitting unread in her inbox. Silence, she was learning, could be a locked door rather than an empty room. Daniel recovered with a nod that belonged in a boardroom. Well, good luck with the hobby. Emily smiled then, not because it was funny, but because she finally understood that he needed it to be a hobby. He needed her work to stay small so his memory of her could remain accurate. He needed the woman he left behind to be exactly where he had placed her. Thank you, she said. I have a delivery to make. She walked past them before either could answer, the boxes steady in her arms, the winter air sharp against her face. At the corner, she heard Vanessa ask softly, Did you see the packaging? It actually looks expensive. Emily did not turn around. She kept walking toward her used Subaru, toward the next boutique, toward the life that had begun in a pawnshop and was now quietly outgrowing every insult Daniel could afford. The next morning, after the encounter outside the coffee shop, Emily woke with Daniel's words still moving around her head like smoke that had found a way under a closed door. Good luck with the hobby. It should not have mattered. She knew that. She had orders to pack, invoices to send, and a wholesale inquiry from a boutique in Portland that had been waiting in her inbox since midnight. But old voices had roots, and Daniel's voice had spent years growing through the walls of her confidence. While the kettle heated, she stood barefoot in the kitchen and looked at the Carter and Bloom jars lined along the counter, each label straight, each lid polished, each one carrying a softness that had required more discipline than Daniel would ever understand. Hobby. The word was small by design. Men like Daniel rarely needed to raise their voices when they wanted to shrink a woman. They simply renamed her work until it sounded harmless. Emily opened her notebook and wrote the word at the top of a clean page. Under it, she wrote every number she had been avoiding because fear had taught her to stay modest. Monthly revenue, wholesale margins, repeat customers, cost per unit, inventory turnover, website traffic, email subscribers. By the time the sun pushed through the blinds, the page no longer looked like a wound. It looked like a business, a young business, underfunded and held together with late nights, thrifted shelves, and Grace's aggressive encouragement, but a business all the same. At 9:03 a.m., Margaret Hayes called. Emily nearly dropped her coffee into a box of blank labels. Margaret did not waste time with small talk, which Emily was beginning to recognize as one of her more merciful qualities. I heard from the Newberry Street owner, Margaret said. Your first shipment sold through faster than expected. Emily gripped the edge of the counter. How fast? 9 days. The number moved through the room like a match struck in the dark. 9 days. Emily had imagined the jars sitting politely on the shelf for a month, maybe 2, hopefully not becoming dusty little monuments to her overconfidence. They want to reorder, Margaret continued. Double the quantity. And the Cambridge location wants to feature the rosemary hand cream near checkout. That is good placement. Emily closed her eyes. For one foolish second, she wanted to call Daniel, not because she needed him, not because she wanted him back, but because some injured part of her still wanted the person who had dismissed her to witness the correction. Then she opened her eyes and saw the empty space on her left hand, pale but steady. No, she would not drag her good news back to the man who had trained himself to misunderstand it. That is wonderful, she said, and her voice only shook a little. Margaret heard it anyway. Wonderful is one word. Dangerous is another. Growth exposes weakness. If you are going to accept larger orders, you need systems before excitement buries you. Emily almost smiled. Margaret made success sound like a natural disaster with better stationery. I know, she said. I am trying to learn. Good. Learn quickly. By noon, Emily had called the shared kitchen in Somerville and reserved more production hours. By 2 p.m., she had requested quotes from 3 packaging suppliers. By evening, she had updated her website, answered customer emails, and created a waiting list for the next batch. Grace arrived after her shift wearing scrubs under her coat and carrying a grocery bag full of protein bars because nurses apparently believed emotional support should contain fiber. She found Emily sitting at the table surrounded by printed invoices and supplier catalogs. You look like a raccoon who started a corporation, Grace said. Thank you. It was not a compliment. I accepted it as one. They worked until almost midnight. Grace packed orders while Emily calculated whether she could afford to quit one shift a week at the stationery shop. The answer was not yet, but not yet no longer sounded like never. Around 11:40 p.m., an email arrived from a customer in Vermont named Susan Bell. She wrote that she had bought the lavender balm for her mother, who had stopped taking care of herself after losing her home in a difficult divorce. The jar sat on her nightstand for 3 days before she finally used it. Now she rubbed it into her hands every night and said the scent made the room feel kind. Emily read the message twice, then once aloud. Grace stopped folding tissue paper. For a moment, neither of them made a joke, which was how Emily knew the words had reached the deepest part of the room. Daniel had thought scale meant impressing investors in glass conference rooms. Emily was beginning to understand another kind of scale, quieter but no less powerful. One woman told another woman. One jar entered one home. One small act of care became evidence that a person had not been forgotten. She printed Susan's email and taped it beside Margaret's business card. The wall above the kitchen table was becoming a map, not of where Emily had been, but of where she was no longer willing to disappear. The first real disaster arrived in late April, not with thunder or drama, because disasters in small businesses prefer the dull costume of ordinary email. Emily was at the stationery shop, helping a bride choose between ivory and pearl invitation paper, a decision the bride treated with the moral weight of a Supreme Court ruling, when her phone began vibrating again and again inside her apron pocket. By the time Emily reached the back room, there were 6 messages from the Newberry Street boutique, 2 from customers, and 1 voicemail from Margaret Hayes. The words in the first email seemed to tilt on the screen. Several jars from the rosemary batch had changed texture after sitting near the front window. The cream had softened, separated slightly, and one customer had returned it, worried that something was wrong. Emily read the sentence 3 times while the paper cutter hummed in the next room, and her body went cold from the inside out. It was not a catastrophe in the grand sense. No one was hurt. No one was angry in a way that could not be managed. But to Emily, who had built every ounce of trust by hand, it felt like watching a crack open beneath the only bridge she owned. Margaret's voicemail was calm, which somehow made it worse. Call me when you can. This is fixable, but you need to respond immediately and professionally. Emily closed her eyes against the shelves of cardstock and breathed in the dusty smell of envelopes. Immediately and professionally. She had spent years responding to Daniel's emergencies, smoothing over his mistakes, making his chaos look like strategy. Now the mistake was hers, which meant there was no one else to blame, and also no one else to rescue her. She left work early, apologizing to her manager with a story about a supplier issue, which was true enough to pass the human test known as saying less than everything. In the car, rain tapped against the windshield as she called Margaret. The problem, Margaret explained, was likely heat sensitivity. The boutique window caught afternoon sun, and Emily's formula, lovely as it was, had not been tested under those conditions. You are not the first founder to learn this the expensive way, Margaret said. The question is whether you hide, argue, or take responsibility. Emily gripped the steering wheel. I am not hiding. Good. Then pull the batch, refund what needs refunding, replace everything, and document the formula change. The numbers formed instantly in Emily's mind, each one unpleasant. Replacements would wipe out most of the profit from the reorder. Additional testing would cost more. New labels, new ingredients, more rented kitchen hours. For one bitter second, she understood why people lied when things went wrong. Honesty was expensive. Then she remembered Susan Bell's email, the retired teacher's review, Grace's first $20 on the kitchen table, and the pawnshop counter where she had decided not to be owned by shame anymore. She drove straight to Newberry Street. The boutique owner looked relieved when Emily walked in before closing, rain darkening the shoulders of her thrifted trench coat. Emily apologized plainly. No excuses. No blaming the window, the weather, the supplier, or the tiny, indifferent gods of handmade skincare. She collected the remaining jars, issued a credit, promised replacements within 10 days, and wrote down every customer concern in her notebook. The owner watched her carefully, perhaps expecting defensiveness. Instead, Emily said, "You trusted me with shelf space. I intend to earn it back." Something in the woman's face softened. Most vendors send an email and hope the problem disappears, she said. Thank you for coming in person. By midnight, Emily was back in the Somerville kitchen with Grace beside her, both of them wearing hairnets that did not flatter anyone. Proof that entrepreneurship eventually humbles even the cheekbones. They reformulated the rosemary cream with less heat-sensitive oil, added stability notes, and labeled every test jar with dates and conditions. Emily sent update emails to customers before dawn. Some requested refunds. Several asked for replacements. One woman wrote back, "Thank you for being honest. I will wait." That sentence nearly undid her. 2 days later, Daniel heard about the returned product through a mutual acquaintance who had apparently mistaken gossip for oxygen. He sent a text so polished it practically wore cufflinks. I heard you hit a rough patch. Scaling is difficult. Let me know if you need advice. Emily stared at the message while standing over a tray of test samples. Once, She might have read concern into it, because loneliness will translate almost anything into kindness if you let it. Now she saw it clearly. He was not offering help. He was checking whether his old prediction had come true. She typed nothing. She deleted the message, set her phone face down, and returned to her notebook. By the end of the week, every replacement had shipped. The profit was gone, her back ached, and her savings had taken another ugly hit. But the boutique kept the account. Margaret sent a 2-line email. Painful lesson. Correct response. Emily printed that too and taped it to the wall, not because it was warm, but because it was true. Success, she was learning, was not a clean climb. It was a series of mistakes survived without becoming dishonest. By early summer, the wall above Emily's kitchen table had become so crowded with purchase orders, customer emails, formula notes, and Margaret's blunt little verdicts that Grace started calling it the Shrine of Stubborn Women. Emily pretended to hate the name, then wrote it on a sticky note and placed it in the corner because accuracy deserved recognition, even when delivered by someone eating pretzels over her inventory sheets. The Rosemary batch disaster had cost her almost every dollar of profit she had made that month, but it had done something stranger too. It had taught her that a mistake did not have to become an ending. The boutiques kept reordering. Customers who had received replacements wrote back with thanks. One woman posted a photo of the handwritten apology card online, and within 48 hours, Carter and Bloom had more website traffic than Emily had seen in the previous 3 months combined. The post did not go viral in the ridiculous internet sense, where strangers argue with each other under a picture of soap because civilization apparently peaked at indoor plumbing. It spread quietly, through women sending it to sisters, co-workers, mothers, friends from old neighborhoods, and people who understood that accountability had become rare enough to feel luxurious. Emily noticed the first shift on a Tuesday morning when she opened the website dashboard and saw 68 orders waiting. She refreshed the page twice because trust, once damaged by marriage and accounting software, takes time to rebuild. The number stayed. By noon, it was 83. By evening, 97. She stood in the stationery shop backroom staring at her phone while rolls of ribbon sat around her like witnesses. Her manager, a kind woman named Denise who had watched Emily grow thinner and then steadier over the past few months, leaned into the doorway and said, "That is your business face." Emily looked up. "I have a business face. You have had one for a while. You just keep acting surprised when the business shows up." That sentence followed Emily home. The apartment could no longer hold what Carter and Bloom was becoming. Boxes blocked the radiator. Ingredient tubs lived under the couch. Grace had nearly tripped over a shipment of glass jars and threatened to report Emily to the fictional department of people who need shelving. So Emily did the thing she had been avoiding because it felt too official, too adult, too capable. She rented a 250-square-foot studio space in a converted mill building in Somerville, with old brick walls, tall windows, a utility sink, and enough room for stainless steel tables. The first time she unlocked the door, she stood alone in the empty room and listened to the hum of traffic outside, the distant sound of a freight train, the small echo of her own breath. It was not glamorous. The floor needed mopping. The bathroom down the hall had questionable lighting and a lock that required moral commitment. But the lease had her name on it. Emily Carter. Not Daniel's wife. Not Daniel's ex-wife. Not the woman who used to stand beside him while he was introduced first. Just Emily Carter, tenant, founder, owner of a business that required keys. She moved in on a Saturday with Grace, the retired woodworker from the market, and Denise, who brought coffee and announced she was volunteering only because she enjoyed watching women make men look foolish from a safe legal distance. By sunset, the studio held shelving, tables, bins, labels, packing supplies, and a small framed print Grace had bought from the Strawberry Ring College student. It read, "Bloom Anyway." Emily hung it near the door and hated that it made her eyes burn. Over the next year, Carter and Bloom changed shape. Emily quit the stationery shop one shift at a time, then finally altogether, leaving with flowers from Denise and a card signed by co-workers who had started buying her products months before. She hired her first part-time assistant, a community college student named Nora who had a gift for packaging and a terrifyingly organized spreadsheet system. She added 2 new products after months of testing, a hand balm for nurses and teachers, and a body cream inspired by the scent of clean sheets drying in summer air. Margaret introduced her to a regional buyer for a chain of independent gift stores across New England. The meeting took place in a conference room in Providence, where Emily wore her navy blazer, carried samples in a canvas bag, and answered questions without shrinking. When the buyer asked how she had funded the first batch, Emily paused only briefly before saying, "I sold something from my old life and invested in the new one." The woman nodded as if she understood more than the words themselves. The order came through 2 weeks later, 12 stores, for 100 units, seasonal placement. Emily printed the email at the studio and taped it to a new wall because the old kitchen shrine had officially retired from active service. That night, driving home through Boston traffic with the windows cracked and the smell of cardboard, honey, and lavender lingering in her coat, Emily realized she had gone an entire day without wondering what Daniel would think. The realization did not arrive like fireworks. It arrived like quiet, a soft, ordinary quiet. The kind she had once mistaken for loneliness before learning it could also be peace. 3 years passed in the strange, uneven way years pass when a person is building something real, slowly enough to feel endless, and then all at once so fast it seems impossible. Carter and Bloom moved from the Somerville studio into a 5,000 square foot production space in Waltham with loading docks, temperature-controlled storage, a small office, and a break room where Nora insisted on putting a real coffee maker because she said no legitimate company should run on instant coffee and unresolved trauma. Emily hired 6 full-time employees, then 12, then 21. She learned how to read manufacturing contracts, negotiate freight costs, manage payroll, disappoint people without apologizing for existing, and sleep 6 hours a night without feeling decadent. Margaret remained close, officially as an advisor and unofficially as the woman who could reduce Emily's panic to ash with one sentence. Grace remained Grace, which meant she appeared at milestones with flowers, practical shoes, and opinions no one had requested but everyone usually needed. The brand grew not because Emily shouted the loudest, but because customers trusted what they could feel. Nurses bought the hand balm in bulk. Teachers ordered gift sets before Christmas. Boutique owners told other boutique owners. A regional department store placed Carter and Bloom in its clean beauty section. A national magazine mentioned the lavender balm in a holiday gift guide, and for 2 chaotic weeks the website behaved like a vending machine struck by lightning. Through all of it, Emily stayed careful. She rejected formulas that cut costs but weakened quality. She refused investors who spoke about her customers as demographics instead of people. She built slowly when faster money dangled itself in front of her wearing expensive shoes and calling itself strategy. Daniel, meanwhile, became a name she heard less often until he returned to her life indirectly through business headlines, because apparently the universe had a taste for irony and access to trade publications. Whitmore Advisory had expanded too quickly into markets Daniel did not fully understand. A failed partnership, a regulatory inquiry, and a series of bad loans had left the company bruised and hungry for capital. Emily learned this from Nora, who walked into her office holding her phone with the solemnity of someone delivering both news and gossip, humanity's least dignified 2-for-1 special. "You may want to see this," Nora said. Emily read the article twice. Daniel was seeking new investors. Vanessa was now listed as Vice President of Brand Strategy, which felt like a title invented by a committee of mirrors. Emily felt no joy at his trouble. That surprised her. Once, she had imagined his downfall as a kind of justice. Now it looked ordinary, almost sad. A man who had built his life on appearing inevitable was discovering that appearances did not pay vendors. She set the phone down and returned to reviewing payroll. The real twist came 6 months later, when Carter and Bloom was invited to present at the New England Founders Forum, an investment gala at the Seaport Hotel attended by regional investors, retail executives, founders, and the kind of consultants who used the word ecosystem until it lost the will to live. Margaret urged Emily to attend. "You do not need their money," she said. "That is exactly why you should be in the room." By then, Carter and Bloom had crossed $8 million in annual revenue, with strong margins, loyal customers, and acquisition interest Emily had not pursued. A valuation firm, hired for strategic planning, had estimated the brand at $18 million. When Emily first saw the number, She sat alone in her office for 10 minutes, not celebrating, not crying, simply staring at the printed report. $18 million. The figure looked absurd beside the memory of a pawnshop envelope, a clanking radiator, and 6 small jars cooling on a windowsill. On the night of the forum, Emily wore a white tailored suit, simple pearl earrings, and no ring. The Seaport Ballroom glittered with blue lighting, glass walls, and the harbor beyond, black and silver beneath the city lights. Carter and Bloom products sat arranged on a display table near the entrance, surrounded by soft greenery and cream-colored cards printed with the brand story in careful, honest language. Emily had just finished speaking with a buyer from Chicago when she saw Vanessa first, standing near the bar with a Carter and Bloom lip balm in her hand. Vanessa was older now, still elegant, but the sharp brightness Emily remembered had been replaced by something restless around the eyes. Then Daniel stepped beside her. For a moment, he did not see Emily. He was looking toward the stage, adjusting his cuff, wearing the expression of a man trying to appear calm while calculating how many people in the room might save him. Then his gaze moved across the ballroom and found her. Recognition struck his face in stages: surprise, confusion, disbelief, and finally the slow understanding that she was not attending as someone's guest. She was the reason one of the sponsor banners carried the Carter and Bloom logo in gold. Before either of them could move, the host stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, our next founder turned a self-funded kitchen table company into one of New England's most beloved independent beauty brands. Please welcome Emily Carter, founder and chief executive officer of Carter and Bloom, recently valued at $18 million. The applause rose around her like weather. Emily walked toward the stage, passing Daniel close enough to see his face drain. Of every polished sentence he had ever used to keep her small, Vanessa looked from the lip balm in her hand to the woman on the stage, and for once, no one had to explain the brand to either of them. Emily reached the podium with the sound of applause moving around her like surf against stone, steady, bright, and strangely distant. The ballroom lights warmed her face. Beyond them, hundreds of people sat at round tables covered in white linen, their glasses catching the blue shimmer of Boston Harbor through the windows. For one breath, she saw everything at once. Margaret in the front row, her expression proud but pretending not to be emotional because apparently dignity required unnecessary labor. Grace near the side of the room, already wiping one eye with a cocktail napkin while glaring at anyone who might notice. Nora standing by the display table with both hands clasped beneath her chin, and Daniel, still near the bar, frozen beside Vanessa as if the room had become a language he could no longer translate. Emily placed her notes on the podium, but she did not look down. She had written a careful speech about margins, supply chains, customer loyalty, and the strength of independent retail. It was a good speech. Sensible, polished, entirely respectable. Then she looked at the Carter and Bloom logo glowing on the screen behind her, soft gold letters against a cream background, and thought of the first crooked label printed in her Dorchester apartment. She thought of the pawnshop counter, the empty velvet box in her coat pocket, the first $40 Grace had forced into her hand, the rosemary batch that nearly broke her confidence, the customer who said the lavender balm made a room feel kind. Numbers mattered. Valuation mattered. Payroll mattered. But none of it had begun with strategy. It had begun with a woman trying to survive the cost of being underestimated. When I started this company, Emily said, her voice carrying more steadily than she felt, I did not have investors, a team, or a 5-year plan. I had a kitchen table, a secondhand mixer, and one decision. I decided that losing one life did not mean I had to lose myself. The room grew quiet in. The way rooms do when people recognize truth before they know whether they are allowed to clap for it. Emily continued. She spoke about women who begin again after divorce, illness, job loss, grief, motherhood, caregiving, and all the quiet endings that never make headlines but still divide a life into before and after. She spoke about products made with care because care itself had been treated like small work for too long. She spoke about building a company slowly, honestly, and stubbornly enough that every customer felt seen instead of sold to. She did not mention Daniel. She did not need to. His absence from her story was the final proof that he no longer owned any part of it. When she finished, the applause rose louder than before. Emily stepped down from the stage into Margaret's brief, fierce embrace, then Grace's much less brief and dramatically damp one. People approached with business cards, congratulations, and the shining eyes of those who had suddenly discovered they believed in founders after hearing a good valuation number, humanity's most reliable spiritual awakening. Emily answered graciously, accepted none of their urgency, and promised only to continue the conversations that deserved continuing. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd thinned and staff began clearing dessert plates, Daniel found her by the display table. Vanessa was not with him. He looked older than he had at Copley Square, or perhaps Emily was finally seeing him without the old lighting. "Emily," he said, "I did not know." She turned toward him calmly. "No, you did not." He swallowed, glancing at the products arranged between them as if they were evidence in a trial he had not prepared for. "I always knew you were capable of more than you believed." The sentence was almost elegant enough to pass as kindness. Almost. Emily looked at him, at the man who had once called her carefulness small, her work a hobby, her pain an obstacle to his future. "Daniel," she said gently, "you did not know I was capable. You noticed after other people started putting a price on it." His face changed. Not dramatically. No grand collapse. Just a small tightening around the mouth, the quiet discomfort of a man meeting a truth that did not flatter him. "I am sorry," he said. And perhaps he was. Perhaps regret had finally reached him, late and overdressed, but real in its own limited way. Emily accepted the apology with a nod because carrying resentment was another form of unpaid labor, and she had retired from working for him years ago. "I hope you build something honest from here," she said. "For your own sake." Then she picked up her coat. Outside, the harbor air was cold and clean. Grace and Nora were waiting near the entrance, arguing about whether celebratory French fries counted as dinner. Margaret had already texted 3 practical notes about follow-up meetings because romance was dead, but operational discipline remained alive and irritating. Emily slipped her hands into her pockets and felt no ring, no absence, no ache that needed filling. Only keys, her phone, and the smooth folded corner of a new purchase order she had tucked away before the speech. Years earlier, she had traded a diamond for enough money to begin. Tonight, she walked into the Boston night knowing the most valuable thing she had ever owned was not the ring someone gave her, but the courage it took to let it go. The following Monday morning, Emily returned to the Waltham production space before anyone else arrived. The building was still quiet, its long hallway smelling faintly of coffee, cardboard, and the cold metallic air that slipped in through loading dock doors before sunrise. She unlocked the office, turned on the lights, and stood for a moment in the soft hum of machines waiting to begin the day. On her desk sat the same framed print from the Somerville studio, Bloom Anyway, now slightly faded at the edges. Beside it was the valuation report, a stack of follow-up cards from the Founders Forum, and a small velvet box Grace had found months earlier while helping Emily clean out a storage bin. It was not the original ring box. That one had disappeared somewhere between the Dorchester apartment and the first studio move, lost with old tax envelopes, broken tape dispensers, and other artifacts of survival. This box was plain navy, empty, and somehow still heavy with meaning. Emily opened it and looked at the hollow inside. Once, an empty box would have felt like evidence of loss. Now it felt like space. Space for choices. Space for work. Space for a life that did not require being selected by someone else before it counted as valuable. She closed it and slipped it into the bottom drawer, not as a shrine, not as a wound, but as a record. Humans were odd creatures, after all, always needing objects to prove they had lived through things their bodies already remembered. At 7:15 a.m., Nora arrived with 2 iced coffees and the alarming energy of a person who had already reorganized 3 spreadsheets before breakfast. Grace arrived 10 minutes later, officially to congratulate everyone again and unofficially because she did not trust founders to eat during success. Margaret called at 8 o'clock sharp, congratulated Emily for exactly 40 seconds, then began discussing the dangers of accepting the wrong capital partner. "Flattery is not financing," she said, "and attention is not strategy." Emily laughed because Margaret had a gift for turning affection into a warning label. The day filled quickly. Employees gathered in the break room where someone had taped a printed photo from the gala to the refrigerator. Emily stood in front of them with a paper cup of coffee in her hand and tried to say something impressive. What came out was simpler. This company started because I needed a way forward, she said. It survived because customers trusted us. It grew because every person in this room treated small details like they mattered. They do. No one applauded dramatically. This was not a movie, and most people were holding muffins. But Nora smiled. Grace cried again, though she denied it with the reckless dishonesty of a loved one. The production team went back to work, and the ordinary sounds of the business resumed. Boxes opening, lids clicking, printers humming, phones ringing, someone laughing near the packing station. Emily stood there listening, and it struck her that this was the real victory, not Daniel's face at the gala, not the valuation number, not even the applause. The victory was ordinary life made secure by her own hands. People had jobs here. Customers waited for orders. Bills were paid from revenue she had earned. The company did not exist to prove Daniel wrong, though it had done that rather efficiently, like a polite machine built by women with excellent memory. It existed because Emily had decided that care, when given structure, could become power. Later that afternoon, a package arrived from the Newberry Street boutique, now one of Carter and Bloom's longest-running accounts. Inside was a handwritten note from the owner and the first empty display card Emily had delivered years ago, slightly bent at one corner, with the original logo printed in imperfect gold ink. "Thought you might want this back," the note said. Emily held it in both hands. The paper was cheap, the alignment slightly off, the design nowhere near what the brand used now. It was beautiful anyway. She placed it in a frame and hung it beside Bloom anyway. That evening, after the building emptied, Emily walked through the production floor alone. Rows of finished products waited on stainless steel tables, labeled, packed, ready to travel into homes she would never see. She turned off lights one section at a time until only her office remained glowing. Before leaving, she checked her reflection in the darkened window. No diamond flashed on her hand. No old promise announced her worth. There was only a woman in a navy coat, tired in the honest way, standing inside a life she had built from one painful decision and thousands of quiet ones after it. Emily smiled, locked the door, and stepped into the cool Massachusetts evening with tomorrow's work already waiting, which was not a burden anymore. It was proof.